Right in the heart of Pakistan's biggest cities, you'll find these massive areas that seem to play by their own rules. They've got houses, schools, and markets, but they aren't quite your typical town. They're called cantonments. So what are they? Military bases? Civilian cities? Or something else entirely? Let's break it down.
If you've ever looked at a map of a big city in Pakistan, like Lahore or Karachi, you've probably seen this big chunk of land labeled Cant. That's short for cantonment, and it marks this really distinct urban space, almost like a city within a city, with its own history and its own set of rules.
So, what exactly is a cantonment? Well, at its core, it's a permanent base for the armed forces. But it's so much more than that. Think of it as this unique hybrid space, where a huge civilian population also lives and works, and the whole thing is run by a special governing body that actually falls under the Ministry of Defense.
And we're not just talking about a few of these. Nope. There are 56 cantonments scattered all across Pakistan, from the middle of major cities to more remote spots. So yeah, this is a really widespread and important part of the country's urban fabric.
To really get what cantonments are today, we have to rewind the clock a bit. Their origins, and pretty much their entire legal framework, are a direct legacy of the British Raj. See, this system didn't just pop up overnight. It grew out of the British need to house their troops separately from the local population. At first, these areas were just under direct military command, but as they got bigger, they needed a more formal structure. So, in 1864, an act brought in a magistrate. By 1880, they could even collect their own taxes. But the real game changer, that came in 1924.
That 1924 Act was a huge deal. For the very first time, it officially brought elected civilian representatives into the governing boards. This laid the foundation for the unique hybrid system that, and this is pretty incredible, still exists to this day.
Okay, so this brings us to the big question, right? If it's this mix of military and civilian, who's actually calling the shots? Well, the power structure is just as unique as the place itself. It all comes down to a body called the Cantonment Board, which is specifically designed to manage this kind of dual identity. And this is where you can really see that unique power dynamic. The board is made up of both nominated military members and elected civilian members. But here's the key part. The military always holds the majority of the seats, and the board's president is always the senior military officer in charge, the station commander. So you've basically got three main players making this whole thing work. You have the station commander, who's the president. You have the elected members, who are the voice for the civilians living there. And then you've got a cantonment executive officer, a professional civil servant who handles all the day-to-day administration and makes sure the board's policies are carried out. All right, so that's the setup on paper. But what does it actually look like on the ground today? Because over the decades, the very character of these cantonments has changed a lot. This quote really hits the nail on the head. What started out as garrison areas, mostly just for troops, have completely transformed. Today, they're filled with huge civilian populations, busy commercial areas, and tons of private businesses. In fact, they're often seen as some of the nicest and most desirable places to live in a city. Actually, this shift is so big that cantonments are now officially classified based on how many civilians live there. The largest ones, the Class 1 cantonments, have over 100,000 civilians. These are basically small cities that are playing by a totally different rulebook.
And as you can probably guess, mixing military and civilian life like this isn't always smooth sailing. It brings up some really complex questions about governance, about the constitutional rights of the residents, and even about the fairness of local elections when one group holds a permanent majority on the board.
So, what's the big picture here? Let's boil it all down and look at the key takeaways from these fascinating and pretty complex spaces.
So, to put it all together, cantonments are these one-of-a-kind hybrid zones that were born out of a colonial past. They run on a shared military-led system of governance, and maybe most importantly, their whole identity is constantly changing as they become less like military garrisons and more like major urban centers in their own right.
And all this leaves us with a final big question to think about. As Pakistan's cities just keep growing and growing, swallowing up the land around these areas, how is this colonial-era system going to adapt? What does the future hold for these unique spaces where military and civilian life are so tightly woven together?